So when we look at police, oh, well, he was resisting arrest. He had weed on him. Okay, and you were just on the train
Should
without a
that be a
mask.
death sentence?
No.
I think we don't have enough conversations about the fact that every time you make an action criminal, every time you make a law criminalizing an action, you do so with the threat of a gun against someone who breaks that law.
Yep.
And I don't think people talk about that or think about the consequences of passing these laws. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Re-Education Camps. This is Undoctrination. I'm Maggie.
And I'm Olivia.
And this week we're discussing police brutality in the wake of the murder of Tyree Nichols. Olivia and I both started getting our feet wet in politics with this issue as we were both teenagers during the first big wave of BLM protests. Olivia, I know you in particular had a very interesting evolution with this issue.
Yeah, I did. And so I think I talked about this in the first episode especially, but my evolution coming into politics was a little bit strange. So I went through my Tumblr phase like every teenage girl does from 13 to 14, again to high school. And I told you guys a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, but I went to a very rural, white, conservative high school where I felt like I discovered a few things about myself, including the fact that I was very more on the right side of the issues most of the time. But this led me to become a little bit reactionary. I didn't know the best ways of research. I didn't take it upon myself to do my due diligence and find out the facts often enough. And so I found myself kind of in a reactionary trap or a cycle where you see these videos of police brutality, and your first reaction was, well, where's the rest of the video? Didn't they deserve it? Were they resisting arrest? Like, you just want to find any excuse. And part of that is because you want to trust your government. You want to trust the people who you're told to trust. You want to trust the people who have been tasked to protect you, so to speak. And so a lot of that came from that. And also a lot of it came from politics. So the people I would follow, a lot of conservative and Republican commentators would parrot these talking points. They would parrot, hashtag Thin Blue Line or Blue Lives Matter as a response to Black Lives Matter or as a response to people being fed up with the police due to police brutality and things like that. And I couldn't explain why I believe those types of things, to put it that way. I couldn't understand and I couldn't explain why I would say things like Thin Blue Line. When personally in my own life, I've had probably one positive interaction with police. For the record, I'm not convicted of any crime. So to put that out there, I'm an innocent, law-abiding citizen, and I have not had very good interactions with the police, just to put it that way. But
yeah,
as my politics evolved, I'm still considering myself on the right side of the issues. I'm more of a conservatarian now, but I have problems with the state. And I think that a lot of Republicans also have problems with the state. They want to have problems with the big government. They love to talk about big government and how the Democrats, the left, the states, the feds, the Federal Reserve, even some more woke Republicans are like now hip to the Federal Reserve. So they talk so much about how they hate the government. They don't talk about who carries the guns and who enforces the government's really, really faulty laws. And so that cognitive dissonance was kind of lifted from my shoulders as I got more and more into libertarianism. And I just like to say, it's totally okay to change your mind. I've changed my mind on the issue probably 2 times at this point, since when I was kind of like a woke Tumblrite to becoming just a carbon copy reactionary conservative to now being a little bit more nuanced. And I feel a little bit more enlightened to have this discussion because I know the statistics, I know the facts now, and I'm not coming in here with any bias. Like I said, I haven't had a lot of positive experiences with officers, but that was also during a time where I thought very positively about the police, about law enforcement. But now I'm more like, this is just another faction of the government, and I'm going to criticize them like I would criticize any other faction of the government,
Yeah, absolutely. What's so interesting is I was kind of coming from the opposite side, and so I really dived into the BLM issue as a teenager. It really emotionally affected me. And I think that's how most teenagers feel. Seeing all of these videos, I think, is really emotionally impactful. So it makes sense why this is such a huge radicalizing issue for teenagers. However, I didn't understand the state component of it. I thought it was explicitly a racial issue. And there were a lot of things that challenged my view of that. And also, I think I talked about this in the first episode. there was a guy named Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who was killed by police. And I remember the whole city just got really on edge. I don't know if you ever experienced this in your own hometown the first time around. I know protests kind of went everywhere across the country in 2020, but in 2016, that was the really like the first mass movement of BLM. And so I remember it came to my city because this man was unjustly killed. And that was really emotionally impactful for everyone in the city. I mean, everyone was outraged. And I remember I was a teenager working food service at the time, and a group of police officers came in to get some food, and the whole restaurant went quiet. Like you could hear a pin drop. It was really intense. And eventually someone broke and like shook their hands and wished them well during this really tough time, because the protests were getting a little out of control. And I remember my stepmom at the time was an EMS worker, and she let us know, like, hey, you should get out of the city. There are people threatening to come down and start just like killing white people and cops randomly. And at the time, I was super pro BLM, and that kind of challenged it a little for me, because I realized, oh, if we're splitting this up into purely a racial issue, then we're really getting into, okay, there's a war and there's two sides and it's completely split on race, right?
Yeah.
We did leave the city, and then we came back after the weekend. That week, I woke up to news that I think it was 4 police officers had been killed in my city. A man did come down from Missouri and just like opened fire on a bunch of police officers at a gas station really close to my parents' house. And that really set into motion for me a really big ideological shift. Not that I became pro thin blue line at that point, but I realized this is so much more of a human issue, and there's something deeper to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, obviously, very recently, on January 7th, a man by the name of Tyree Nichols was pulled over for reckless driving. And 3 days later, he died in a hospital. Olivia, did you ever see the video that his parents put out of like
his
the
parents
compilation?
put out a video.
Yeah, they put out this video compilation of him like skating, because he really loved to
I did see
skateboard and film sunsets. And Tyree Nichols seemed, at least from what we know about him, to be a really gentle person.
He had a 4-year-old son.
Yeah. He was a father, exactly. And obviously, you know, the police waited a week to release this footage, and a lot of governors deployed the National Guard to make sure that there weren't riots that would happen in reaction to this video. But in the video, you can clearly see he tries to run away at some point for whatever reason. We don't really know. There's a lot of speculation. But once the police catch up to him, they essentially brutalize him for several minutes. Like, it's really, really hard to watch. Yeah, and in the video, they kind of pick him back up. I think you were talking about this, Olivia.
Yeah, it was brutalize is the perfect word. They stand him up. He runs away. He's screaming for his mother. I believe he was on his mother's street, so it wasn't like he was just screaming in general. He like wanted his mom to come save him. Like, this is a grown man screaming for his mom to come save him. And he runs. They catch him. They are pushing him around in a circle almost, punching him, standing him back up, pushing him to the next person, punching him to the next person. And these are 5 Black Memphis, Tennessee police officers.
From what is it called? The Scorpion Unit? Do you know anything about this?
I believe 2 or 3 of them were from the Scorpion Unit, and this was supposed to be basically a safety task force to clean up the streets of Memphis. And to put this a little bit more in perspective, not only were these 5 officers Black, they're now since they've been arrested and charged, there has been another officer who is white, who I believe arrived at the scene afterwards, who has now been looked at like, yo, you didn't do something wrong too. But the 5 people who brutalized this man were black. The police chief of the Memphis Police Department is a black woman, and I actually looked a little bit into her history. She was
Mhm.
previously fired from the Atlanta Police Department. She was in internal affairs, and she allegedly, this was why she was fired, she allegedly covered up the sexual abuse case that a coworker's husband had. So he was caught with a child sex abuse case, and she told internal affairs to not investigate it. And so
Wow.
after an internal investigation on her, the Atlanta Police Department fired. Now she brought it, like she petitioned it, and she actually got it turned around like months later, but then she just
Mhm.
left, and
Started
she
over in
became
Memphis?
she became Memphis, Tennessee's first black female police
Wow.
chief. Woo! But this is a person who is corrupt, I believe.
Yeah.
And this is a person who doesn't care about safety, clearly.
Mhm.
And I think we saw that negative police culture, which is not a white supremacist culture, because you see this black police department headed by a black woman that still
Yeah.
has this culture of unaccountability that we see so frequently now.
Right, and I had no idea about her past, but that seems to filter into that
You know?
unaccountability
Yeah.
type of thing as well, right? Like, what emboldened her to think that she could be able to cover up for something so heinous?
Absolute power, I think, more often than not corrupts
Yeah.
absolutely. And so when we give, I mean, when the state, I mean, we
Mhm.
give the state the power, I guess. I mean, we're pretty much complacent to the state because we're not rising up against it constantly, which low
Yeah.
key we should at this point. But we give the state power. The power gives absolute power to the people. But I think one of our main problems is, maybe just speaking for myself, but I think a lot of people view the state as this entity that's almost otherworldly or divine, as in
Yeah.
it's not made up of flawed people, just our neighbors, our family, our friends, these people around us that are very flawed. And so when we give these
Mhm.
people so much power, this is not an elected position. This is an appointed position by the city,
Absolutely.
and they touted it at the time as a positive thing for diversity. They're like, this is a black female chief. They
Mhm.
hired
So that's
more
gonna
black
clearly solve the
officers.
issue,
They
right?
hired more black
Yeah.
officers. And so in 2020, after the George Floyd Black Lives Matter
Mhm.
riots, Memphis police drastically loosened their requirements to become a police officer. You used to have an associate's degree. You do not have to have college experience now. You used to be able to pass like a really long like fitness test. You no longer have to do that. You used to have to do all this hours of training, and they lessened the amount of hours of training. So
Why
I
would they
believe it
do that? Do
was
you think their recruiting numbers were just down and they were trying to bolster
after George
recruitment,
Floyd,
or
when people started, like, when I say I criticize the police, that doesn't mean I condone hating them, attacking
Mhm.
them, unfairly, criticizing them, or,
Yeah.
or killing them like somebody did in your hometown. But this all happened as a result of the George Floyd BLM protests in 2020. And so a lot of people quit and they couldn't meet their recruitment
Mhm.
goals. So what the Memphis police chief did, this woman from the Atlanta Police Department who got fired in the past, she drastically lowered the restrictions, and it came out.
Right.
So all out of all the 5 police officers that beat Tyree Nichols, only one of them had been there for like more than 5 years, and he had been there for 6 years, and the rest of them had been hired right around the
So
time
they
where
were
they
pretty
had
much brand new.
they were new, had a couple years under their
Mhm.
belts, and they were hired around the time when they loosened the restrictions. So it was a recipe for disaster, and none of the reasons involved white supremacy, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. What I find so interesting about this case is the difference in reaction
Hmm.
between George Floyd and the protests that happened afterwards. And this case, so in this case, the police fired all of the officers involved immediately and then
Hmm.
immediately charged them with several felonies. Those included second-degree murder, aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, official misconduct, and official oppression. So the police department immediately took action against these officers, and the police chief, like her or not, you know, immediately released statements, called it a horrific tragedy, immediately tried to make sure justice was brought, and they waited for about a week to release the footage.
Hmm.
Do you have any idea why they did that? Because I think a lot of people were
Hmm.
suspecting that waiting a week and waiting until Friday to release the footage was going to make the riots worse. But I honestly thought they kind of handled this situation pretty well, and it might work as a blueprint moving forward for police departments that encounter this.
So I don't necessarily have an opinion on the waiting a week. Obviously, that was strategic, and
Mhm.
I don't know all the thought that went behind it. But to me, I've actually criticized the fact that they released it like 5 p.m. on a Friday in the past because it did seem like a recipe for disaster to me. It
Mhm.
seemed like another thing, like, okay, great, everybody got off work, let's riot for the weekend. Like, that seemed like that's what they were
Yeah.
gearing up to do. So obviously, that didn't happen. I'm so thankful that didn't happen.
Right.
But to compare the reactions a little bit, I think it's because, now this is just my theory, I think it's because people can't use it to promote their narrative that it's all about white supremacy. Black Lives
Mhm.
Matter can't use it for their Marxist
Yeah.
ideology.
I
Now,
mean, they're
I talk
trying, right?
they want to real bad. They
Yeah.
want to real bad, but it's not working out for them
Yeah.
because anybody with two eyes, anyone with one eye even, can see that this is just not a white supremacist issue. And if you do even just the slightest bit of research, like I did, into that Atlanta Police Department issue, into the diversity hire, into the loosening of
Mhm.
the restrictions, you can see it's not a white supremacy issue.
Yeah.
So I think that people were faced with the opportunity to look their cognitive dissonance in the face, and a lot of people did and a lot of people didn't. But the facts of the matter show that
Mhm.
this is a state problem, not a white supremacist problem. This had almost nothing to do with white people. Like I said before, there's a black female police chief, 5 black officers beat a black man to death who had a black son
Mhm.
who is now fatherless. Um, People really were forced to kind of look at the situation and be like, well, if I go out there and I protest, what am I going to have to protest? They can't have a sign that says down with white supremacy. I mean, they can
Mhm.
pull out their ACAB signs, but at the root of a lot of this Marxist ideology is the whole white supremacy, critical race theory type of thinking where everything stems back to systemic racism. Everything stems back to white people. It's white people's fault. And this is an ideology perpetuated by Black Lives Matter. It was founded by
Mhm.
Patrice Cullors. And she said in an interview in 2020, we are trained Marxists and we use this ideology in our activism. And I mean, we've talked about Marxism before. We know what it is. Maybe she thought
Mhm.
that other people didn't know what she was talking about, but people called her out on that. But that still didn't stop the George Floyd riots. And so now a lot of people I think are waking up to it because where's the money, first of all? They bought 3 mansions. I think that the new meme is like instead of BLM, it's like buy more mansions like BMM or something like
How much were
that.
those mansions worth? Do you remember?
Millions, millions. I remember like 2 years ago they bought one in like Beverly Hills and I was like, where are you
What
guys
are we
fighting
doing in
black
Beverly Hills?
are you guys fighting police brutality against black people in Beverly Hills? Because I promise
Like,
it doesn't exist there. This is
yeah.
not a problem there.
Are there even that many cops in Hollywood? Like, I don't.
I mean, it's just like it was just so absurd. And then Patrice Cullors said, "These houses are for my family. It's to help my community." Da 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 da. I'm like, this is not no Section 8 house that you're giving out to people. You are buying mansions. So, anyways,
Right.
I think
When
people
this
are
money was supposed to go to communities, right?
the
Like, this was supposed to
so
go to.
many of
Yeah.
the families of the victims. So, like Trayvon Martin's mother, I believe, had something to say about it.
Mhm.
Tamir Rice's mother has something to say about it. Several of the victims' mothers who BLM like went to bat for, quote unquote, have now come out and said, yo, where's the money? These people scam me. They were using my son for clout. They were using his victimhood status for their own purposes. So there have been several families of the victims that have stood out and said this. So I think that the support
It's just disgusting.
behind BLM
Yeah.
is faltering, and that's a great thing. But now let's replace that white supremacy narrative with the narrative that is actually going to. I mean, it's not even a narrative. Let's replace it with the facts that are actually going to help us solve the situation where this is the state's fault. We can't trust the state. We can't trust people who carry guns for the state. And let's start there.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, even conservatives in 2020 started to realize
Mm-hmm.
that the police weren't necessarily on their side. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying that ACAB, like all cops are bad. What I'm saying is they are the enforcement
Mm-hmm.
arm of the state, of the law, right? So when the law is unfairly targeting you, they are going to come after you too. You know what I mean? Like,
For a long time they didn't see it that way, and I did
mhm.
call out a lot of, and not generalizing Republicans, but a lot of Republicans didn't say anything until it impacted them.
Yeah.
And that's really sad. And I know that's human nature. And a lot of people won't speak out about something until it affects them. But
Mhm.
that's the whole premise of free speech. I'm currently not being censored. I have a Twitter account. I have not been arrested or put on any watch list that I know of for anything that I have said. But there are people out there who have been put on a watch list, who have been censored, who have been jailed for things that they've said. And it's nothing that I would ever say or ever ever
Mhm.
agree with, but I'm standing up for those types of people. So I feel like we have to apply the same standard all the way around. So when we look at police, oh, well, he was resisting arrest. He had weed on him. Okay, and you were just on the train
Should
without a
that be a
mask.
death sentence? I think we
No,
don't have enough conversations about the fact that
we
every
don't.
time you make an action criminal, every time you make a law criminalizing an action, you do so with the threat of a gun against someone who breaks that law.
Yep.
And I don't think people talk about that or think about the consequences of passing these laws. What's so interesting is the left, what were the people that were out on the streets raging against police brutality, but they're often the ones that are passing these laws
Yep.
that lead to people dying. I
Yep.
mean, Eric
Look at-
Garner, wasn't he just selling like untaxed cigarettes and he ended up being
Yep. And
killed?
who's in charge of New York City? Like we have, I
Yeah.
mean, in New York City, this is like under Bill de Blasio, they were making like big gulp soda cups illegal. Like what? You're just criminalizing and illegalizing everything. Now in California, they just made flavored tobacco products illegal. So now there's been issues with some gas stations, some stores, like literally because I shop at local dispensaries around here, not going to hold you. And there's literally been issues where police have raided and busted in and gotten local business owners and small business owners in trouble for having flavored tobacco products, Juul products, vape products, things like that. And it is so insane that we saw Eric Garner be choked to death, choked out, saying, I can't breathe, over selling a pack of loose cigarettes. And we're passing more anti-tobacco laws that are being enforced by people carrying guns. And another thing that I will point out, another reason why I won't say ACAB, but it's really weird because you can criticize the government and say, I hate the government, I hate Congress. You can say, I hate public education, but nobody thinks you're talking about all teachers being bad. Nobody says all teachers are bad. Nobody takes that as a slight against all teachers, even though everybody who knows me knows I'm very anti-public education. I'm very anti-state sanctioned or state-funded most things, But when it comes to criticizing law enforcement, people take it as you're one of those ACAB people. And I am not one of those ACAB people. I'm criticizing the system, not the individual. In this case with Tyree Nichols, there are 5 individuals that I am criticizing. But I think the system enabled them.
They use their power and authority to kill a man. I mean, I don't know if they knew they were killing him at the time, but I'm sorry. Like in the video, you could see that he could not stand up. And they just kept wailing on him.
Another little bit of research I did.
What was it for?
Well, another little bit of research I did was one of the cops who was recently hired, around the time where they loosened the restrictions, was a former correctional officer who left that position after he had criminal charges brought against him for the brutal beating of an inmate. Now those proceedings did not go forward because, and this is the inmate, he represented himself, and when he was in I believe he claimed he was in solitary confinement and couldn't make the documents he needed to for his court date. So the charges against that correctional officer, who later became a police officer in the Tyree Nichols situation, were dropped. And so I feel like it's a little similar thing where it happened to the Atlanta Police Department lady, the new police chief of Memphis Police Department. The things were dropped. She petitioned, but it's like, why are there so many controversies with all these people involved in this department and all these people who contributed to Tyree Nichols' death? There's just clearly no semblance of accountability. At FEE, we talk about ending qualified immunity a lot. There are so many things, like actual policies we could put into play, because Black Lives Matter, they just talk about defund the police. They don't talk about any reforms. They don't talk about anything that would actually help the situation. And we want to bring the solutions.
Defund the police, that's just a catchphrase to them, if we're being honest.
It means literally nothing because, okay, what aspects of the police do you want to defund? How much do you want to defund it by? Where are we going to redirect that money to? Oh, counselors, crime scene counselors. Okay, that's not going to help if somebody's committing a violent crime, first of all. So it's just
and
no
like
solutions.
Defunding the police is actually really unpopular with the majority of Americans. Although
even Black Americans.
Exactly, because that means like nobody's coming and helping you when a violent crime happens to you or someone is stealing your stuff. But actually, Gallup did a poll in May 2022, so super recently, and this is after all of the riots in 2020, which you would think people would become less sympathetic to criminal justice reform because the riots got so bad. But actually, almost 90% of Americans want some level of reform of police departments. About 81% want police officers who violate the rights of others or who abuse their positions of authority. They want them to be held accountable legally. Like, they want charges brought up against those police officers. So this is pretty popular among Americans. But you see time and time again, anytime qualified immunity, which, by the way, qualified immunity is essentially a decision that was established by the Supreme Court protecting government officials from civil lawsuits when those government officials are acting in good faith or in accordance with their jobs. What that's come to mean is that when the police violate your rights, you essentially have no track for suing them or getting justice. And what this does is embolden police officers to violate your rights because they know they're protected by the law.
Yep. And so when somebody's rights are actually violated and they're like, okay, something actually wrong did happen here, guess who has to pay out? It's not the individual police officer. It's not the police department. It's the city. It's the government. It's people's taxpayer dollars, essentially.
Absolutely.
It
but
doesn't
all
come
over
away
the
from that.
country.
Yeah. And I will just like to point out, sorry, but the fact that it was a Supreme Court decision, not legislation, that made this policy. This was not voted on by any member of the public. This was not voted on by any member of the legislative branch. This was a Supreme Court decision that made it this way. That I think is unconstitutional because it leads to taxpayer dollars being spent to mitigate the costs of police and state mistakes.
And I mean, post 2020, there was legislation brought up in a lot of states across the country to end qualified immunity. There was a huge push to end qualified immunity across the country. And time after time, it was police unions that shot down these laws. Do you want to know why? Because they want to protect their members from being held accountable. So not only do we need to end qualified immunity, we have to bust these police unions that are essentially just trying to protect their own and have no accountability.
Yep. And to shine a light on the other side of the argument. So what I hear a lot of, not all, but a lot of conservative ideologues who argue against the abolishment of qualified immunity will say, well, police would just be tied up in court all the time. People would just use the opportunity to sue them all the time. Every other profession that has a high rate of things maybe going wrong or legal troubles, like doctors, dentists, like really any medical professional, they have like their professional career license insurance that covers things like that. They're not worried about being sued incessantly by people for no reason because they have insurance that covers that. They have licenses that cover that. I don't understand why we treat police, people who have the power to kill and to take into custody and to chase people and to save people as well, to deliver good services to people as well. Why don't we have something similar set up? Because that would involve some level of responsibility and accountability.
Absolutely. And I think people are scared that people aren't going to want to become police in that instance.
Don't become a police officer.
Don't
become a police officer if you feel threatened by the thought of accountability.
Yeah, but I mean, why are we setting it up so that the job of becoming a police officer is essentially like the one ring to rule them all in Lord of the Rings, where if you put it on, you become invisible and you can essentially do whatever you want and you're not going to be held responsible for your actions. Like that is what people mean when they say that there are a lot of bad apples. It's not necessarily that people who are bad just want to become police officers. It's that power corrupts people, you know? And it definitely is magnetic to people that want that level of immunity.
Yeah, I think that it's certainly a vicious cycle because police departments now, they feel very vilified. A lot of departments are seeing lower applications, so they're having to lower their requirements to meet their mandatory requirement policies. So I believe when Memphis had lowered their requirements, they were like short like 300 officers or something, like a crazy amount.
Wow.
And so, but of course, when we lower these requirements and we have things like qualified immunity that lets people act out and essentially live out their bully fantasy or whatever, of course they're going to be vilified even more. And so less and less people want to become police officers. More and more people are, I think, going to be more likely to maybe abuse the system in a way that, okay, like I do think it's a plausible point to make that people could abuse like a system without qualified immunity and like incessantly sue police officers now, after we've seen the vicious cycle of them being vilified and lowering the restrictions and brutalizing
Mhm.
people. I mean, this is
Yeah.
going to take a lot of work on both sides to come to
Absolutely.
a solution.
Yeah, and I definitely don't think we should vilify cops, but I think if we were to restructure the system to put in place accountability measures, that would actually really go a long way to
Yeah.
rebuilding trust between officers and the communities that they work in, right? Because the
Yeah.
people that are in those communities would feel assured that if something would happen to them, that the officer would be held accountable for it.
Yep. And
It
can I
seems
just
so odd to me that we have these two different levels of society, and it has nothing to do with class, right? And it has everything to do with, are you part of the society that gets held accountable when you harm others, or do you work for the state? That's so
it's so
bizarre.
crazy
That's so
because
bizarre.
police officers are not rich people. They don't get paid a lot.
No.
There's not a lot of great perks that come with the job, other than the fact that there's not a lot of accountability that comes with the job. And let me just point out that I do believe that the culture is completely different between, because we've talked about large city and urban police departments. We haven't really compared it to local sheriff's departments,
Mhm.
small town police departments, and I think that the culture is a lot different there. And there is a
Yeah.
much higher level, at least in my experience, much higher level of trust between the community and police officers. So I just wanted to put that out to make it, make it clear. I'm not generalizing all police departments across America. In these
Mhm.
areas where these police brutality things happen, it's almost always in a Democratic controlled city. It's almost always in a very urban environment where there's lots of crime and unrest anyways. So there
Mhm.
are a lot of factors that go
Yeah.
into this, but it all makes the problem worse, and it all empowers people without accountability.
Yeah, I think another great point to this as well is, we do give police officers guns and the ability to enforce law at the point of a gun. Why are we why do those laws include things that you would never think reasonable to kill someone over? Like, why
Right.
are we policing violent crimes that involve theft and murder and abuse and rape? Why are we policing those the same as we police, like,
It it is it
random
blows
victimless
it
crimes? Like, that
blows
makes no
my
sense.
mind that somebody could be pulled over on suspicion of reckless driving, and we haven't even seen a video of Nichols' alleged reckless driving yet. Maybe it
No.
was reckless. Who knows? But
Yeah, maybe he was
there
swerving,
he
but
could have he could
that
have
doesn't mean.
ran somebody over on accident, and I still would have been like, "Oh my god, this is a crazy response." Like it is just so insane how police hold the general public to a way higher standard than they hold themselves,
Mhm.
and I was just thinking about Breonna Taylor and about how she died, and there was a firefight between, I believe it was her boyfriend and the police when they were breaking into their
Yeah.
residence, and that brought up the question. Well, why should citizens not fire at police if they're executing a no-knock warrant at their residence? If they're breaking into their home, if somebody's breaking into my home, I feel like I should have the right to defend my home. If that's law enforcement or if it's a random criminal, I mean, this is
Yeah,
not your
how would he
property.
know that it was, because they didn't
That's
announce themselves, did
that's
they?
and that's why, I believe it was Rand Paul, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my God, the Republicans don't care, the white supremacists." That's why Rand Paul, who is a senator from Kentucky, the same
Mhm.
state where Breonna Taylor was killed, introduced the Breonna Taylor bill, which is like, "Yo, no more no-knock warrants. I don't like qualified immunity. Let's come up with solutions there." But
Mhm.
Democrats don't like when Republicans come up with solutions because they just want to fight and raise money off the problems instead of actually solving them. So that didn't happen. That didn't pass. But shout out to Rand Paul for
Shout out
for
to Rand
introducing that,
Paul.
because it
Yeah.
it showed, at least for the people who are paying attention, like me, who I'm not a Republican, I'm
Mhm.
a registered independent, but as somebody who looks at Republican politics, because there's not a lot of conservative or libertarian representation in the government, at least true conservative or libertarian representation, I was praising him for that. And I believe Thomas Massey, another, well, he's a congressman, but also from Kentucky. He also had good things to say on that, and so I was happy to see that. But again, it it doesn't work when both sides are not looking for the solution. It doesn't work when we're using it as a political talking point instead of an actual goal or something, a problem to be fixed.
You know, I think unfortunately, COVID could have been a uniting time for conservatives and liberals on this issue, because COVID lockdowns really showed the police state's hand, right? And this was not just in America, like all over the world. In India, they started like spraying migrant workers with disinfectant chemicals. In the Philippines,
Oh my God.
police and local officials trapped curfew violators in dog cages. Like, there was some brutal stuff happening, and that could have been an aha moment for conservatives. But as soon as that happened, it was like chaos.
As soon as the
just reigned.
conservatives started, and of course we're generalizing, but as soon as the conservatives realized the truth about the police, the left did a complete 180 and started defending the police. They
That's
believed
true.
they
Oh my
believed
gosh,
the science
yeah.
so hard that they literally excused police shutting down churches, breaking up Thanksgiving dinners, locking
Yeah.
people up, shutting people's small businesses down. There was a woman who ran for state rep in Texas, Shelley Luther. She was a Yale endorsed candidate whose business, she owned a salon. She was thrown in jail. She was
Like, this
thrown
little
in jail
lady.
for working at her hair salon. She was thrown in jail. But she ran for state rep after that. And Greg Abbott, the perfect conservative Republican governor of Texas, had literally funded like thousands of dollars against her opponent. And he's the one that made the policy that threw her in jail in the first place when he put lockdowns on Texas. So it was
Insane.
Republicans too. But the left literally saw people like that and were like, well, you deserved it. You didn't listen to Dr. Fauci. The police have the right to do that. And it was so
People are
insane.
literally dying. Yeah.
It was so, you're killing grandma. The police, they literally thought that the police were justified in locking people up for going to work, for having a party, for doing, for going about their lives.
Actually
so
absurd.
Yeah.
Same rules apply with gun control too, right?
Dude,
like, who do
yep.
conservatives think are coming to take the guns?
Don't ask them that question. They don't want to answer that question.
Who do you think is coming to take your gun?
When I was in my cognitive dissonance phase, when I was like 15, 16, starting to, be a law enforcement fan or whatever, I would not have been able to answer that question truthfully and still remained in that talking point. And so I had to come to that conclusion on my own to kind of get out of that mindset. But a lot of people are just not challenging themselves enough.
Yeah.
Maybe this podcast will help them with that. And that's not me trying to sound like high and mighty, because I changed my opinion by listening to people. That's really the only way you can get exposed to other ideas, is to listen,
I think it's pretty telling that both sides are fine with police abuse of power when it's against their enemy. And this just...
Yeah, it's not a conservative thing. It's a human nature thing.
Absolutely. I do think it's important for us to say one more time, like, this is not to bash police officers, right? There are like plenty of people who join police departments and become police officers because they do want to help their communities. And my hometown of Baton Rouge has become just overrun with crime and violence. And there's like teenagers dying now at bars off campus. Like, I understand why someone would want to become a police officer and protect their community. But it's like, when we have a system set up so that there is no accountability for when like police officers hurt other people, then that can corrupt almost anyone.
And the problem goes so far all the way up that it's almost impossible to conceive. But obviously the police are enforcing laws that our legislative branch makes, that we all vote for, that we all endorse, that we all pay taxes for. Even if every single police department in America was reformed, even if qualified immunity was abolished everywhere, there would still be people being arrested, being brutalized, being killed for unjust reasons, because we have unjust laws in this country. And that is, I think, at the root is the state and the enforcement of unjust laws.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, Olivia.
Thank you. I usually do, but I'm feeling really good about that one.
On this specific topic, man.
I'm a little bit passionate, and maybe I I will admit I'm not completely unbiased. Like I try to
Mhm.
be, but I grew up seeing police
Yeah.
brutalize people. I've seen it happen in real life, and I've always thought about ways that should not happen anymore. And I
Mhm.
guess when I first got into politics, I got caught up in the trap of being a little reactionary, of seeing 5 seconds of a clip and being like, well, there must have been more to that situation. So I guess that, the
That
police
means
did
he
nothing
deserved
wrong.
it. Yeah.
That means he deserved it. I guess he
Yeah.
resisted. And I fell into that trap, and I hate that I did, but I'm glad that as an adult, I've come out of it, and some people never do. But I think that everybody who listens to our podcast is at least open to
Yeah.
new
I
and
think so
different
too.
ideas. And I don't even want everybody who listens to agree with me, because I'm open to changing my opinion too. Because I feel like
Mhm.
even talking to you, I have my opinions have become a little bit more nuanced, because you came from the other side, which I think is funny because you're white, I'm black. I came from the Blue Lives Matter side. You came from the Black Lives Matter side. It's just
That's so
hilarious.
weird.
It's so funny.
Yeah. We're breaking all conventions, Olivia.
Yeah. Yay.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap. Thank you guys so much for watching. Obviously, we'll be releasing another episode next week. You can find me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. And Olivia, where can we find you?
I'm also on Twitter at Rondeau Olivia and Instagram at rondo.olivia.
Awesome. And make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave us a comment telling us any topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Thanks again and have an amazing week.
Bye.
Bye.